Hello and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute working on Europe issues, and I'm delighted to welcome today's panelists to a discussion on Vilnius after 100 days, a retrospective on the NATO summit, which we of course had 100 days ago this summer in the Lithuanian capital. Here at Hudson, we often look at the NATO summits in the Vilnius summit as embedded in a three-part summit. The first being the Madrid summit of 2022, where a new strategic concept was adopted and where the process of bringing Finland and Sweden into the alliance began. Of course, Finland joined the alliance, formally acceded to the alliance in April of this year. And at the Vilnius summit, the debate continued over Swedish accession to the alliance and, of course, Ukraine's status within NATO. The membership action plan was dropped, the NATO-Ukraine Council was formally adopted, and the new battle plans for NATO were also worked through, submitted, and adopted by the alliance. And now, 100 days out, many NATO ambassadors in Brussels are beginning to think about the Washington summit, which is quickly approaching, which President Biden has called for next year to celebrate 75 years of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but again, also to tackle the issues of Ukraine and other outstanding files and what else is to come in the coming months that NATO will have to deal with and face. I could think of no better panelists than the three gentlemen who have joined me here on this panel today to talk about Vilnius and look back after 100 days, where we stand and what comes next. Joining us from the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius, we have Professor Tomas Janeliūnas from the University of Vilnius. He's also the Chief Research Officer at what I think we can describe as Lithuania's most prominent think tank, the Eastern Europe Studies Center, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Hello.
We have also from not the Lithuanian capital, I think he's at another residence somewhere in the woods of Lithuania, the former ambassador to the United States, Žygimantas Pavilionis, who of course is a prominent voice on foreign affairs. He's a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Lithuanian Parliament. Thanks so much for your long-standing friendship with Hudson Institute and for joining us this evening at this late hour.
My pleasure.
And finally, my partner in crime here at Hudson, none other than Luke Coffey, one of America's foremost voices on NATO, transatlantic relations. And every summit, he very excitedly reads through the communiques and parses every word, unlike some other analysts who just go on TV and pretend to talk about it. Luke, thanks for bringing your expertise to this panel. And of course, if you want to follow Luke's work, just stay on hudson.org and navigate to his expert page. So Luke, never take for granted, even though it's your home organization, that you've been invited to speak. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
Let's start with our guests from Lithuania, given that they lived the summit in person and experienced and read all the commentary that followed. Perhaps, Mr. Ambassador, we could start with you and you could give us your opening take on the summit, where we stand and what's next.
Okay, knowing that after each summit, you have next summit and it's never-ending challenges and dealing with them. So I will not concentrate on positive things, 2% defense plans, kind of political agreement on Swedish protocol ratification that still needs to be done. I'm going to Turkey next week with my Baltic brothers about that. But something that disappointed me deeply was non-invitation of Ukraine to NATO. Well, looking positively, of course, we worked so hard trying to explain that the only way to delete the gray zone in this part of Europe is to go Central European and Baltic way. Look to us. You created the miracle, from communist ashes, from enslavement. You created wonderful, great, vibrant economies, strong and powerful, and inspiring all the others. Fighting for freedoms from Baltic to Black Sea, Belarus, Taiwan, and so on. So let's roll on. Let's continue. But something happened. Something that I will make it blunt. Though we had more or less majority of capitals in favor of opening the door to invitation to Ukraine, even in Berlin, we had 5 parties with us. Bundestag was with us, but Chancellor Scholz was not, as well as President Biden. That was most surprising. that America, because even like 15 years ago, in Bucharest NATO summit, America was with us. We had, big German and French resistance. This time, President Macron was with us. So something, was missing. We, of course, for looking positively, we put an invitation of Ukrainians to NATO on the table. Very uncomfortable maybe question for few capitals, but it is on the table. And now it's a big question, what will happen in Washington? Why I was afraid of, I was in Bucharest NATO summit. We failed 15 years ago, 2 months after Russia invaded Georgia. Because Russians, this is the capital that if they feel the weakness of the West, they invade. We think that they invaded Ukraine because they felt the weakness of the West in Afghanistan. They took it as a clear signal. Americans and all the others are so weak that we can continue grabbing and occupying countries. Because nothing happened with us after Georgia, more or less nothing after Crimea. So if, why not? So I was afraid that after Vilnius, something happened. And I'm just back from Israel. I was very close to Gaza. I saw atrocities that I never saw in my life. I'm shocked deeply because for me, it's, first of all, ammunition that we found in those kibbutz, Russian, North Korean, and Iranian. It's, the atrocities of level of the Holocaust that we quite well known in Lithuania. And for me, it was an indication that axis of evil started to work in the planet. The evil that felt also in Vilnius, that alliance is not so strong, alliance is still not able to get a final strategic decision to win, to allow Ukrainians to win or not, to defeat Russia or not, just keeping Ukraine in a gray zone, not extending invitation. So I'm worried if we do it again in Washington NATO summit, and I feel it, that democratic administration is not ready to celebrate the future of NATO. They are ready to celebrate the glorious 75 years of the past, but we have to be, we have to be proactive. We have to stop this axis of evil, because if we don't, I was just today reading the statement of IRI president on the Hill. He was actually thinking about Taiwan. Why not? Why not Taiwan? You see what's happening in the Baltic Sea with those interesting, interesting accident with cables. So if we want to dismantle the axis of evil that works together, that kills and occupies, we have to concentrate on main, organizing center nerves. Yes, it is Iran. We have to introduce sanctions to Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but this is, of course, Russia. And the best way to do it is to start membership talks on Ukrainian NATO membership. This is just at the level of administration. This doesnand mean Article 5. Article 5 is only after it is ratified by all the members. It is exactly what Atlantic Council, and a lot of other prominent Americans are proposing now in that great study. So maybe this is the way, because if we show the weakness, we show appeasement, they will go further. President Biden, in his speech, mentioned Baltic states and Poland. Well, this is something that makes us really nervous. But, why not Taiwan? Why not any other testing grounds? Because those autocracies, they feel it. They feel that Americans are going to elections. You are divided as never before. They see the rise of Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. And by the way, Middle East crisis will make them grow, because again, migration will go to Germany. They see elections in France. So if big capitals will be paralyzed by more or less pro-Russian forces they have in their own political bodies, and America will be paralyzed by elections, this is exactly time to kill the rules-based order and, you know, to install their own order of communist Bolsheviks, Iranian Ayatollahs, and Hamas. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Oftentimes, these challengers are described as discrete actors in individual, separate arenas of competition with the U.S. But I think you raised a good point, which we at Hudson often like to focus on, and that is the connective tissue between these revisionist powers and how they're beginning to work, perhaps not outright planning various moves together, but they're certainly feeding off of the strategic opportunities that that one or the other provides to them. So distraction in one area of the world might lead to action in another, and so on and so forth. Professor, it's your turn to shine. Give us your take, please.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to point out three main processes or tendencies that are important when we talk about how the security situation has changed in Europe since the NATO summit in Vilnius. One of them is definitely positive, and two are not, in my perspective. So the first one is an increasing role and military commitment from Germany. And this is important. This is important for Lithuania specifically, but at the same time, it's a crucial process for the general deterrence of Russia and the more secure and stable eastern flank of NATO. And I'm talking about the deployment of NATO's forward present units in the Baltics and the German commitment to deploy a brigade-size unit in Lithuania. So just before the NATO summit, German defense minister declared that Germany is ready to permanently station a brigade of around 4,000 troops in Lithuania. And of course, this deployment will be conditional on Lithuania building the required military and other infrastructure, such as barracks, training areas, and storage facilities. But still, now, 100 days after the summit, Lithuania and Germany will finalize and sign an action plan for the brigade's deployment implementation. So that should probably be signed in Vilnius in this December. And I think that in short, this development is the most positive thing, at least looking from Lithuania's position. The deployment of the German brigade definitely will contribute to the changing principle of NATO deterrence, to deter by defense, not act only as a tripwire, but to deter on the ground in practice and not only on paper. And also the increased Germany role as a military aid provider to Ukraine as well. It is also becomes more visible. Right now, if I'm not wrong, Germany provided already more than $17 billion of military aid to Ukraine already, and it is the second biggest single donor after the United States. So the increased role of Germany, even in such a short term after Vilnius summit, I think is a very positive sign, because European nations are already accepting that they had to contribute more to the security of NATO on the eastern flank and to the security of Ukraine as well. The other two tendencies are not positive, unfortunately. One of them is the NATO membership of Sweden. Žygis already mentioned about that. And I remember the excitement of the night just before the Vilnius summit when it was announced that Turkey would not object to Sweden's accession to NATO. And many experts, including myself, at that time believed that Erdogan would deliver what he was promising. But now we have the end of October, and there is no sign that Turkey and Hungary will keep this promise. And what is more worrisome for me, I see opinions and comments, for example, from some Hungarian experts who are trying to extend their arguments as to why the Swedish membership of NATO should be considered more carefully, or why it's not just a formal matter or something like that. In other words, there is already some tendency to bring more doubts about the NATO membership of Sweden. And Turkey, of course, is also not rushing to back Sweden membership either. As official data shows, the Foreign Affairs Commission of Turkey's parliament has received already almost 60 international agreements to review, and it's excluding Sweden's. There's no Sweden's membership on the Turkish agenda so far. So yes, some say it's related to a delay on the United States side, as Congress should approve the 20 billion sale of F-16 fighters to Turkey, and while Congress struggles to find a new share, this may take a while. But there's a lack of trust. Is definitely a lack of trust on the Turkish side, and Turkey is not rushing to ratify the NATO bid and is looking for a sign that the United States is taking steps at the same time. And of course, as Žygis mentioned, the war in Israel only complicates this issue of delaying even further. And the third point is about the military assistance to Ukraine. This is the main priority and the main concern at the same time. I fully support the fastest track to the Ukraine's NATO membership, which is the only sustainable way to secure Ukraine in the long term. But let's be frank, it won't be fast or easy. And military aid is what can change the course of this war. And any delay in military aid to Ukraine and any discussions prolong the war and just benefits Russia. So looking at what we had at Vilnius summit and what we have now, there are more and more struggles to keep up with the military assistance flow. And we see some worrisome signs of war fatigue in Western countries. And the support for Ukraine becomes a matter of some political fights in election campaigns, as Žygis said. In other words, the situation now is even less optimistic for Ukraine to maintain the focus than in Vilnius was at the NATO summit in July. So more and more energy is required from Zelensky to keep the priority of supporting Ukraine on the very top of NATO countries' agenda, including the United States. So that would be maybe my first remarks.
Thanks for those three takeaways. Luke, Coffey, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. It's difficult to follow two presenters like you've just heard, because they've really touched on all the main points. I'll put a finer point on some of the points that they have made, and then maybe I can add a new thought here. On the past 100 days, I have seen very little progress on really advancing that cause for Ukraine's membership. There's plenty of noise coming from the civil society and think tanks and whatnot, but you don't really hear messaging coming from governments. And even those governments who are supportive of issuing an invite at Vilnius, they have also gone quiet. Of course, that doesn't mean that they have changed their tone, but they're just not perhaps as vocal. Maybe they're keeping their powder dry as we get closer to Washington. But I think it's important that we keep this drumbeat constant, making the case for the invitation to be extended to Ukraine, and start now explaining to the public why an invitation doesn't mean a war for NATO, but an invitation offers a realistic and credible journey for Ukraine to get into the alliance. The other issue, which the professor mentioned in good detail, is Sweden. For whatever reason, this has fallen off the radar in the media and in the discussions I'm having. I rarely hear anyone mention the fact that Sweden hasn't had its time in the Turkish parliament, or now that Hungary is making things difficult and challenging. We were very hopeful, considering President Erdogan's comments back in June, and I think we heard those comments and we just became complacent. I think we need to double down our diplomatic efforts to find a way around this obstacle, and we have to get the key players around the table and make the case and make this an issue, put this issue back on the agenda. You know, Turkey's instincts support enlargement. You know, ironically, Turkey has been one of the most vocal supporters of NATO enlargement over the years. And you know, even President Erdogan's comments leading up to the summit in June about Ukraine joining surprised some people in the alliance who perhaps don't follow Turkish NATO policy very closely. But this issue of Sweden has fallen off, and we have to get it back on the agenda. I think one of the mixed outcomes over the past 100 days has been on spending for Ukraine. The latest data from the Kiel Institute, which was published in September, tells us that as a percentage of GDP, 20 European countries now spend more than the United States when it comes to aid to Ukraine. That overall European commitments to aid to Ukraine, when you factor in military, humanitarian, refugee, economic support, now doubles that of US commitments to date. This is great. We need to do more in Washington to advertise this point and raise awareness of this. But this is no excuse for us to not do more either in Washington. We're having a big debate heading in the coming weeks on more funding and assistance for Ukraine. We need to continue making the case. And I believe that there is still strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill to pass more aid to Ukraine if such an issue gets to the floor for a vote. Now, one issue that I think NATO has handled well over the past 100 days since the summit is they've handled the strategic shock, the unexpected strategic shock of a potential major crisis in the Balkans really well. I thought that the White House was very forward-leaning last month when it announced that Serbia had mobilized a significant number of troops along the border with Kosovo. The administration didn't provide a figure, but they described it as being unprecedented. I think this was a wake-up call for NATO, and NATO responded quickly by deploying reinforcements from the over-the-horizon force that the British were providing at the time, based in Cyprus. And I thought that quickly deterred and defused the situation. And we saw, you know, in the days after that deployment, things starting to calm down in the Balkans. But we have to keep a close eye. Serbia is Russia's proxy in the region, and Russia will continue to use different divisions across Europe as a way to make things difficult for NATO partners, but also advance Russian national interests. And I suspect that whether we like it or not, at the next summit, we're going to have to discuss the situation in the Balkans. And in fact, I would say even before the next summit, at the various defense ministerial meetings, the foreign ministerial meetings, we need to, you know, keep an eye on the Balkans. So I'll stop there, Peter. Thanks.
Thanks, Luke. And since you spent some time on the Turkish-Swedish issue, Žygis, you said you're heading to Turkey in the coming days, maybe even next week. What arguments are you going to bring to the Turks about why it's in their interest and in all of our interest for Sweden to join the alliance?
Well, Turkey considers Baltic states as their friends, and for good reasons. When we declared our independence, Turkish embassy in Vilnius was opened one of the first. And we worked together in Caucasus. And this is also something positive is going there. My prime minister is just back from Armenia. I was also in Armenia and Azerbaijan. I really hope that maybe till the end of the year, we could have a deal, peace deal, getting Russians out, at least from Armenia. and Azerbaijan. And then, of course, Georgia is a bit sinking, but that's another issue. This is historic, thing that would increase the positive role of Turkey, I would say, in the region. And also, we will try to help them as much as we can to proceed with accession to European Union. We were one of those advocates to start accession talks. So, and finally, we need Swedish accession to NATO more than Swedes, I would say, the Baltics. And if we are together as NATO members, we have to understand each other. But there is another positive dynamics in EU. We are waiting for a recommendation of European Commission with great leadership of President von der Leyen. And we hope that Commission will recommend to start accession talks with Ukrainians and Moldovans to the European Union. And then we will have a big political decision in December, European Council, to open accession talks or not. And then if we do that historic decision, I still remember decision on Lithuania in 99, how much it changed my wonderful country, with all those talks and reforms that followed. We became the Baltic Tigers and so on. So, of course, we have a quite specific situation in Ukraine, but still the power, immense power of European Union integration, the transformative power is huge, much bigger than the Russian power they try to employ. So I hope that from December, we will be able, with the power of European Commission, German, French, and other members, we will come to Washington and say, guys, don't you remember that before Bucharest NATO summit, those enlargements were always coming in parallel. Actually, NATO enlargement was first to Central Europe, and EU only then followed. We Baltics, we joined it together because it will be just a stupid waste of taxpayers' money, of our taxpayers' money, if we try to fix Ukraine from inside, fixing all the pipes, roads, standards, and those barbers like Hamas in Middle East, they just come and kill and bomb. We need an iron fence. This is NATO fence, the only fence. And yes, of course, weapons. Actually, I applaud the decision on ATACMS. The more, the better. They need to be armed like Poland is armed today. This is more or less the same size of the country. And look how Poles look today and what we provide to Ukrainians. How many tanks, how many Leopards? 20, 30? Poles have 1,000. This is the number needed. So let's finish the job. Let's stop this axis of evil, at least in this place. Let's create Europe whole and free. And let's, later deal with all those Ayatollahs and, communist Chinese, because, if we do nothing, the war is coming just by doing nothing. This, not by invitation of Ukraine to NATO, exactly by non-invitation. You invite the evil to proceed in Balkans, in Indo-Pacific, in America, in our own capitals. It needs to be stopped.
As you mentioned accession talks with Ukraine and Moldova, I would just encourage our viewers to check out, if you haven't seen it already, on Hudson.org, our event just last week. This will be airing on Monday. Today we're recording this on the previous Friday. So just yesterday in case of recording, but Monday when this airs, of President von der Leyen and Hudson, she stopped by on the sidelines of her summit with President Biden, the US-EU summit, and she raised this in her speech, picking up talks with Ukraine about European Union accession. Tomas, if I could go to you, I raised in introducing the panel the setting aside of the membership action plan, as well as the establishment of the NATO Ukraine Council, elevating that format for the Ukrainians to sit at the table in discussion. Are we to read that as a meaningful step, or is it a way essentially to distract everyone from the non-invitation that was issued at Vilnius? How should we read this? Should we be encouraged or should we be disheartened?
Well, of course, if that would be taken just as ordinary procedures for just peacetime for any other countries, that would mean really like a positive sign. To say, if that would be let's say 10 years ago, when we would speak about potential of the Ukraine's membership to NATO or something like that, of course, every of this separate single step would be regarded as a huge success, let's say for Ukraine or any other Eastern European country. But right now, when Ukraine is at war, and when every day, to say it's a day to survive, I think that, of course, President Zelensky was disappointed about the final result. And yes, the NATO-Ukraine Council may provide some useful format for negotiations about some details, about some preparation matters. But all of that doesn't matter so much if we have no clear vision about timing and about procedures that would lead to the full-fledged membership of NATO. To say this Council of NATO and Ukraine doesn't have the vote to proceed to the really political will about accepting Ukraine. It's still just a consultation forum, just a consultation structure. And also the skipping the action plan for membership is also, it was almost already known before Vilnius summit that there is no need anymore for action plan because it was constructed for some peacetime accession processes just to follow the very procedures, the very adaptation to NATO requirements. And right now, Ukraine demonstrates that they are already very comfortable with NATO military equipment, with NATO standards, and in some cases, they are just providing the most successful results using all these NATO equipments in the very short time. So they are the most ready in the military sense, the most ready nation right now in Europe to fight a real war. That's the mission of NATO. And I think this skipping of map of the membership action plan is, of course, is a kind of appeasement, political appeasement, just to show something. But just to conclude, I think, of course, without any real decisions, they will provide no much optimism to Ukraine.
Thanks. Luke, feel free to pick up any what you might consider loose threads hanging out there in the discussion. But, you know, I've asked the two guys in Lithuania about the Vilnius Summit. I have to ask the American who works out of Washington about the upcoming Washington Summit, what we should hope for there. So perhaps that'll be the core of my question, but feel free to address anything else you'd like to.
Just one point on Ukraine's path to NATO membership. The most direct and fastest way to get Ukraine into NATO is to give them the weapons they need for a decisive and quick victory. And for those who are worried about these gray areas and providing Ukraine, weapons and not enough weapons at too slow of a timeline, we have to change this thinking. We have to give them the weapons they need to win to get them into NATO. On the Washington Summit, of course, we're going to have to deal with all of these specific issues. How do we deal with the Ukraine membership issue? What about Sweden if they're not already in? I mentioned the Balkans already. Of course, Baltic security will always be an issue that we need to keep an eye on. But I would say in more general terms, the summit that's marking the 75th anniversary should be one that refocuses the alliance back to basics. I would love, for example, for the opening act of this summit, for there to be a reading out loud of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty. It's only 1,100 words long. It's a long op-ed. Wouldn't take long to read. We got to remind ourselves why this alliance was created, what it's meant to do, and how that can apply to the challenges and problems we have today in the 21st century. And luckily for us, it does provide us with a useful tool to deal with the many challenges that we face today. If you just go through the treaty, Article 2 of the treaty talks about the need for every member state to invest in defense at a level where they could defend themselves, because NATO is only as strong as its weakest link. That applies today when we talk about the spending debate. Article 4, many people have heard of Article 5, of course, but Article 4 is the article that allows a member state to bring an important issue to the agenda to discuss. It forces consultations at the NATO level. As we head into this era of hybrid warfare and asymmetrical warfare and gray area operations, perhaps Article 4 is the most useful tool for us to get together and address certain issues. Of course, then there's Article 5, which remains as relevant today as it has ever in the history of the alliance, and that is the mutual security clause. An attack on one is an attack on all. And then finally, there's Article 10, which is relevant today as it was in the beginning days of NATO, and that's the article on enlargement. And the bulk of this conversation today has been on enlargement. And Article 10 states that any European country can join NATO if the alliance wants it to join. So we have to keep that door open, because there's never been a more powerful tool to use to entice a country to reform their government, their security services, their military, sometimes their economies, than the prospect of getting into NATO. Because these countries also know that getting into NATO also means eventually getting into the EU, and it also gives reassurance to international investors that their nation is a safe bet for investment. So we need to get back to the basics. Look, NATO doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but according to Article 6 of the 1949 treaty, which defines where Article 5 applies, NATO must be, and I quote, in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer, able to defend its member states' territorial integrity. So I think we need to get back to basics when it comes to what we expect and hope NATO to do for the next 75 years.
As a concluding round, I'd just like to ask each of you to address, now that we are 21 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, how you see political will for sustaining Ukraine's fight for your home countries, and if you'd like, you can zoom out into your region. So Žygis, perhaps you could start with how Lithuania feels about the current situation in Ukraine, whether or not there's some optimism. I've heard war weariness in other capitals of Europe. Does that apply to your peoples as well? Or is there still equally robust, strong support, as we've seen in months and at this point, given 21 months and years past on this issue?
Yeah, I will maybe conclude like this. I thought I was already living through historic times when we declared our independence, we entered the EU and NATO, when, it was declared that history ended, but not. History is happening now. Those are very historic months from our decisions. In the next 12, 14 months, the world order will depend. And looking to President Biden, tell me, what are the main things that his administration will be remembered? Afghanistan, negative, and then Ukraine. He owns Ukraine. He really made something that, that was not expected. But if he fails in Ukraine, he will be remembered with two biggest failures. And it's not only about Biden. I'm talking about America. If we are going to celebrate 75 years with two biggest security failures on a global level, it will be a big signal for axis of evil to proceed. And they will. Don't even think that they will not. The American isolationism that I would say started with President Obama, continued to President Trump, and if it is again confirmed in Washington NATO summit, it will, I think, to be over dramatic. For me, it looks like 39 when axis of evil, they meet. Well, this is not Molotov-Ribbentrop. This is Xi, this is Putin, those are Ayatollahs, those are Hamas. They divide the world, they are ready to attack. And if we just make statements like Chamberlain made it 39, well, guys, wait for another big war. Wait for your Pearl Harbor. But maybe we can still fix it all. Imagine we create a successful story. We defend Ukraine. We create Europe whole and free that Bush the father wanted to create. You create such a story that a lot of democracies will be inspired. They will fight. You know, we are kicking, we are strong. We are actually strong still. So I would love, we would not only go to some details and protocols, we would create history at Washington NATO summit, and everybody will say, yes, oh my God, America is strong, NATO is strong. They just got the biggest army into their body, because Ukrainians are safety, they contribute to our safety. They're net contributors. Europe will be strong and safe with Ukrainians. So, wow, maybe we do not touch that area. Maybe we think twice before occupying Taiwan. Maybe we don't mess with Balkans. Well, maybe we don't mess with Israelis. And, this is how I see Americans leading.
Thanks. I'm reminded a little bit to return to the theme of this burgeoning axis of revisionists. Robert Gilpin, the famous professor at Princeton, who developed hegemonic stability theory, wrote at length about the danger of superpower transitions and how violent they can be. U.S. GDP still constitutes roughly where it's been for decades, a quarter of world GDP, and Europe still has a very powerful economy and market. I would hope that we still have the strength to stand up to those who think we are in a transition zone where they can begin to attack and call out and push the American-built and European sustained order over the years. But we're certainly being tested, and it really is a matter of leadership that's required right now. Tomas, how do you see the situation in the Baltics and their support for Ukraine?
Yes, Peter. The support for Ukraine in the Baltics is still very high. Let's say just the recent poll of Lithuanians show that more than 80% of Lithuanians supports the financial and military aid to Ukraine. So this war fatigue is maybe it's already visible in some other Western European countries, and especially those countries which are just having some political campaigns, electoral campaigns like Poland, like Slovakia, and others. But in the Baltics, our position didn't change just compared with last year or something like this. Our people and our politicians are very strongly advocating, and you can see Žygi's position as well. So they are still doing as much as they can to pursue partners inside NATO, inside European Union, about providing faster perspective of the membership to the European Union and to the membership of NATO. And I believe that the European Commission will recommend to begin the negotiation talks with Ukraine about the accession to the EU. And that could be maybe one of the positive steps just before the next period of negotiations, what we can do more about Ukraine. But at the same time, I'm a little bit skeptical that after this, let's say, positive decision in Brussels about the beginning of negotiation talks, there are no more quite a positive perspective for Ukraine. What we can do just to encourage Ukrainians and to keep up fighting with a bigger motivation, because we are already used everything we could in a sense of procedures or some political structures or whatever. And now, right now, we are just struggling to take another big lap to say we still struggling to make the most decisive decisions, because every small steps, every small encouragement, every small motivation instruments are already used, and we have to do something more bold, more strong, just to make another big decision. It's not all about procedures anymore. It's really about choices, what we're gonna do, and what we make for the future of Europe and for the future of Ukraine.
Well, and I think there's some worries, and I've heard from Baltic state officials that if the West imposes, that's strong language, but helps generate a ceasefire of sorts in Ukraine, hooked to arms control, that the Baltics have essentially unloaded their military kit to Ukraine so that it can fight. And suddenly, having done that, the West has agreed to some sort of ceasefire that also keeps troops far away. Hence, I think leading with the German decision to station troops is so important that you mentioned earlier. It gives some assurance to the Baltic states. But setting all that aside, Luke, what do we want to tell our European friends about what's happening in Washington? How to look at it?
Well, like everyone else, I really don't know what's happening in Washington. No, there are two issues that need to be addressed head on. The first one is leadership. We need leadership at the top from both sides of the aisle in Washington on the issue of Ukraine. Americans are not tired of supporting Ukraine. They might be told that they're tired of supporting Ukraine from those anti-Ukraine members of Congress, but that's very much an inside the Beltway take. Your average American doesn't think about arming or not arming Ukraine day to day. They care about inflation, healthcare, education, the economy, and jobs. They only care about issues like Ukraine when they're asked about issues like Ukraine. So we have to have leadership at the top explaining to the American public why it's in our interests, how we can easily afford it, and how this advances the U.S. national interests across the globe. We have to understand also that we're in historic times. So the second thing we need to focus on is making sure we think about the era in which we are in. This isn't the standard course of geopolitics. We are living through a very difficult time that requires statesmen and stateswomen to guide us through this with leadership, with the threats coming from Iran, with threats coming from the Chinese Communist Party, with threats coming from groups like Hamas, and with Russia enabling all of this. We have to understand that we're living through moments that our grandchildren will read about in history books, and we have to act accordingly. When I was a young Army officer, I was once told that the definition of leadership is to convince people to do something that they otherwise would not do or want to do. And that is what's lacking right now. We need leadership explaining to our publics why we can and why we should support Ukraine, have them defeat Russia, deter Iranian aggression, deter Chinese aggression, and help Israel defeat Hamas. We can do it if we want to. We just need the leadership to make the case.
Great. That's a rousing conclusion. So with that, I'll say thanks very much to our two colleagues, Lithuanian, Žygis and Tomas, for staying up rather late to help us record this discussion. Thank you so much for your friendship to Hudson Institute and to your commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance. Luke, thanks as always for joining me here at hudson.org. I hope you will stay tuned on our website for all of our programming on all of these issues, which, as our panelists have described, are rather interlinked, be it the conflict in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the rise of China, and the threat that it poses across multiple dimensions. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you all for joining us.